But before we start with the program, I want to tell you briefly about our Center of Excellence. So Centers of Excellence are funded by the European Union, and they are focal points of competence and knowledge on European Union subjects, and in our case, business and human rights. Our center is based in the law group of Wageningen University with two key partners, Yaroslav Mudriyi National Law University in Kharkiv, Ukraine, and the Belgrade Centre for Human Rights in Serbia, both represented today. The focus of the center, as the name suggests, is on the EU corporate sustainability agenda, particularly the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And we approach this topic from a human rights perspective. And the core team of this center is made of human rights legal scholars. So human rights law is really our distinctive angle. Centers of excellence are also about the external dimension of EU policies. And in our case, we chose to focus on candidate countries to the EU, hence our partners in Ukraine and Serbia, which of course are both candidate countries to the EU. So in the next 3 years, we will have events, podcasts, research papers, and we will also work on developing roadmaps on corporate sustainability for policymakers and businesses. To follow our work, I invite you to follow the law group of Wageningen University on LinkedIn and or Instagram, whatever you fancy, and you have the details on the slide here behind me. So a bit of context for today, as some of you in this room and online already know, the EU corporate sustainability agenda is in jeopardy, with the EU Commission currently working on a so-called omnibus proposal. This omnibus is expected to water down the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that was finally adopted in May 2024. But it will also apparently include changes to the Due Diligence Directive sister text, namely the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This omnibus proposal is expected to come out next week on 26 February. So obviously, this is very important context for today's event, but also we do not want this proposal to take all the space in today's discussions, even though, of course, we will discuss it. How states and companies address the human rights and environmental impacts of global corporate activities, or to phrase it differently, how to enhance corporate accountability for human rights and the environment is one of the core questions of our times, and it is really bigger than the omnibus proposal. So I very much want to convey the idea that whatever happens next week, the business and human rights agenda will continue to exist. We can still advocate for the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as defined in the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And we can still rely on the concept of responsible business conduct as defined by the OECD. And we'll hear from Christine Kaufmann in the second panel for the OECD perspective. So there are still ongoing important cases against companies being decided by courts around the world. People working within companies, professionals in corporate responsibility units today, next week and next month will still have to make decisions about the potential human rights and environmental impacts of their company's operations. Multi-stakeholder initiatives will continue, etc. So let's keep our eyes on the ball and let's focus on what matters beyond the omnibus, human rights and environmental protection, and how we can engage policymakers, businesses, trade unions, civil society, and academics on business and human rights questions, both within and outside the European Union, including, of course, in Ukraine and Serbia, as is the focus of today's event. So with our Center of Excellence, we very much look forward to contributing to and facilitating those discussions with a variety of actors. So let's start doing this today with our different panels, starting with our first panel, which I will go and sit here and introduce in a second. Thank you so much. All right, this is working. Okay, so to turn this. So it's really my great pleasure to introduce our first panel of the day. Our panel discussion is on navigating uncertainty, the EU corporate sustainability framework and candidate countries. We have a very distinguished panel. I will first introduce Heidi Hautala. Heidi is an expert on sustainability and corporate accountability. She was the Vice President of the European Parliament between 2017 and 2024. And she's also the member of the high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war in Ukraine. And also you've been, of course, a driving force on responsible business conduct within the EU Parliament. We're very grateful that you're here. Welcome to Wageningen. I will introduce all three panelists and then I will give you the floor. Our second speaker is Jeroen Verburg, who's a Senior Policy Officer in the Responsible Business Conduct Unit at the Trade Policy, and Economic Governance Department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. So thank you for coming back to Wageningen. As I understand, you're a graduate from Wageningen University and you haven't been for some time. Have you found it changed? We shall see. Welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation. And finally, last panelist, last but not least, is Alexandra Kuxova. Alexandra works for the DG Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. I had to actually read this at the European Commission, and she's team leader on corporate sustainability and responsibility. We're very grateful. Also, you're here given this extremely busy agenda at the Commission at the moment. Thank you all. I will ask you each question and then we'll see where the discussion goes. So I will start with you. So obviously, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this, but you've been a driving force behind the adoption of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive last May and the years before. So maybe to start with, how do you feel about the current discussions to go back on the commitments that were made not so long ago? And also, given the topic of today, how does that influence how you discuss the responsible business agenda with candidate countries, for example, Ukraine, with which you have worked on these questions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Does it work?
I don't know. Does it work?
No. It does. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. And I want to congratulate you for the launching of this Center of Excellent Jean Monnet on corporate sustainability and human rights law. It can really become a very important piece in the puzzle and an important hub for these developments, which very much rely on interactions between policymakers, academics, and businesses. So on these uncertainties, I think there are two kinds of uncertainties now. We have the hesitation by the EU to continue on the path towards mandatory human rights and environment due diligence, which is very much now based on the narrative on competitiveness. And I ask myself very often, how come that this notion of competitiveness has taken so much for granted, as defined by Mario Draghi in his report last September, which has become a bit like a Bible. A lot of the Commission documents now are sort of copy-paste from the Draghi report. How come that it is not so much more a subject for, let's say, academic research? What is this competitiveness that Draghi talks about? Of course, he's not totally blind to, let's say, the dimensions of human rights or environment, because it wants to create a kind of a balance between competitiveness and decarbonization, which is a key concept in his report. But there is another dimension to the uncertainty now, which is that we have this geopolitical turmoil. And then it leads me directly to the topic of accession countries and business and human rights agenda, because now we see that this search and hunger for critical raw materials is very much also defining the behavior of main powers. At extreme, we see now that Donald Trump wants to make a transactional deal with Ukraine on the critical raw materials. And of course, we have to understand that most of these resources seem to be in the occupied territories. So if Donald Trump wants to make a deal with Putin, maybe he will be ending making a deal with Putin on the critical raw materials and not with Ukraine. So this is a very gloomy idea, but it creeps into my head because we've seen something quite unprecedented in the previous weeks. But then this geopolitical turmoil has also affected Brussels, that we can now see that the Commission and the EU decision makers think that they have to somehow follow this thinking that the Donald Trump administration has put in place, which means weakening human rights policies, weakening environmental protection, maybe doing away with the Green Deal. So this is the gloomy part, but then of course we see that, as you said, Nadia, that the business and human rights agenda is still, it's continuous. This is irregardless of what happens in Brussels next week or next month. Many companies are really committed to this agenda, and we would want to hear more from them and not from business as usual type of associations like Business Europe, who are dominating the influence on this agenda that the Commission is now considering.
Thank you. I will. Oh yeah. So, Jeroen, I would like to ask you about your approach to the transposition process. Obviously, you are very far along in this process, and I would really like to hear from you, perhaps for those who are not familiar with what the Netherlands has done so far with their bill on corporate due diligence. Maybe you can recap a little bit that first, and then maybe explain how what is happening in the ministry at this moment. You glued to the discussions on the omnibus. How do you prepare, also in light of what's been happening in the Netherlands on these questions in the past few years?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation for today. It's the launch of this excellent center, and as you mentioned, it's nice to come back. I graduated here 19 years ago. All these buildings were not here yet, and there was no campus, but it still feels familiar. So thank you. And yes, well, you already mentioned the omnibus, and it feels a little bit like we're working in parallel universes. There are 27 member states working on the transposition, and I can update you a little bit on where the Netherlands is, what has been, of course, shared. We swiftly started when it was adopted in May. Over the summer, a team of colleagues from my team in the policy department and our legal experts started drafting the concept bill, and last November and December it was open for consultation. So it was open for 6 weeks, and we received a lot of feedback. Over 60 organizations, businesses, lawyers, trade unions, NGOs responded, resulting in over 650 individual remarks that we reviewed and are now updating in the concept bill. And yeah, for the Netherlands, it's maybe a different process than in other member states, but we really need those 2 years of transposition because of the parliamentary process that is still ahead of us. So the next step for us is actually, well, scheduled for the end of March, early April, to go to the Council of State, in Dutch Raad van State, to have the bill, well, also judged by them. And then they will give an advice. We will, I'm not going to make any jokes about the advice of the Council of State and what you do with it. Some other ministers take it as an advice and continue, but we'll of course look at it seriously. And then the process of Parliament will start with the second chamber and the Senate. But yes, the omnibus next week, what will it bring? There's a lot of rumors coming from Brussels, and we are curious what the Commission will say. And I know Alexandra probably cannot go into it this morning, but next week we will get clarity, because what will they tell the member states that are transposing at the moment? Are you pausing that process? Do you continue as normal? While another discussion is taking place, because how much will change on the CSDDD? It's an omnibus. It will cover the the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSDDD, and the taxonomy. The objective, streamlining these legislations, lower the regulatory burden. That's something that the Dutch cabinet is in favor of, at least lowering the burden. That's also in the cabinet program. But we hope that it's done by looking at the reporting obligations. Where is it complex or unnecessarily doubling reporting obligations? And look at the delegated acts underneath these directives of the CSRD and the CSDDD. Where can you make changes on for example, the reporting standards that have been developed? Are there criteria that you can take out or make it easier for companies? That's a discussion that we like to have. But hopefully the core of the CSDDD is not touched. But as I said, a lot of rumors, and some things will be opened, and then we'll enter a next phase. But it feels a little bit, to make a sport analogy, we're 2 years of in the transposition process. We're not even halfway. So the analogy of a tennis match, we're playing the match. We finished the first set, and now the referee decides, let's apply easier rules. Hopefully, I'm not offending anyone when I say let's apply the padel rules instead of the tennis rules. That's of course a complicated process, and then that's why the question, like, what will be told to the member states? Connecting it to the candidate countries, as you introduced, not exactly what we're working on in my team, but of course, looking at the CSDDD, it applies also for non-EU countries. So these candidate countries are not in the EU yet, so the obligations work in a different way. If they have revenues within the European market, it will apply for those companies. But of course, when they do enter the EU, more stricter obligations will enter into force. And it's not about only the environment or human rights, of course, in those countries or in those production chains, the value chains. The OECD guidelines also talk about good governance, taxes, corruption. And those are, of course, topics that are also being discussed with these candidate countries. So a lot. I'll leave it to that.
Thank you. We'll come back to all speakers, of course. Thank you, Alexandra Kuxova. Thank you for being here from the Commission. So obviously, I know that there are some things you can say and some things you cannot say, but I want to focus really specifically on what does this new situation, but also in general the corporate sustainability agenda. What is your approach or the approach of your team in the negotiations with candidate countries, considering, of course, these uncertainties we've just discussed, but also, of course, the situation in Ukraine? How do you approach these questions on responsible business conduct and business and human rights in these discussions?
Thank you. And let me first also congratulate you for the launch. It's very nice to see when EU-funded projects come to the real life, and most on this very specific topic, at least very close to my heart. Now, coming to your question, of course, the procedure of accession talks, it's very aligned procedure. We know exactly when the calendar is, almost 1 year ahead. So the procedure is following its normal rhythm, the normal calendar. But I think what is important to say that this CSR policy in the accession process is quite new. We discuss it under enterprise and industrial policy because it's a horizontal policy. Before, of course, the CSR agenda of the Commission was very much focused on the smart mix of measures, very much on the voluntary side, based on the international guidelines, UNGPs, OECD, ILO. So this was the entry point. Then we had some legislation. So actually, when my country was accessing EU, we had no accession talks on CSR issues because it was not very, very relevant. There were no legal acts at that time. Then we had shareholder rights directive, non-financial reporting directive. So it started a little bit later. And now we actually moved from the agenda of very much voluntary to very much mandatory rules. So I think it's something also quite new to us in the accession process. I think what is important to say that we still, when we talk about with the accession countries, we still keep international standards in mind. We still keep the approach with smart mix of measures. And I think where is the challenge, at least from my perspective, is that we discussed this particular topic in one chapter, as I said, in the industry, policy and enterprises. But each and every legislative proposal is being discussed in a different setups with different colleagues, different ministries, and also different colleagues from the Commission. So what we are trying to do on CSR policy is really to pass a message of horizontal, holistic approach, put it all together, keep coherence and coordination. And I think this is something which is very important and also message to accession countries in these talks. You need to talk inside of your countries. You need to talk to ministry, keep some kind of multi-stakeholder process. And also what was there already in the past years, our agenda was have a national action plan, have a national strategy, put those people together in one room, so we can really continue this in a holistic approach and we can understand why we are doing this. And it's not only about the one or another piece of legislation, like now CSDD is taken at the spotlight because, there is this uncertainty, there is omnibus announcement, but it's not just about CSDD. It's about much more. And be it on the legislative side, deforestation regulation, conflict minerals, battery regulation, forced labor ban, CSDDs, you mentioned CSRD, but also there is the other part, how you link it to other policies like public procurement, how you link it to taxation. You mentioned also other issues which are relevant for CSR policy. And of course, now in these uncertain times, I would say regarding accession countries, they're in the same situation as EU member states. I'm sorry, and there is uncertainty. We cannot change now. We don't know until maybe next week what exactly will change. I think the core of due diligence, I would assume will not change because this is really the core element of the whole CSR policy. And we have a lot of due diligence laws. Yes, companies are complaining. Yes, there is a complex business environment, and we did this exercise as a company. In my team, we really try to put ourselves in the shoes of automotive company who falls under all of these legislations. And yes, there are inconsistencies. You have different definitions. You have different scopes. Sometimes you cover only human rights. Sometimes you cover environmental issues. And this is creating, for me, a level of complexity which is not necessary and which links to this pushback. So I think having an omnibus would make much more sense to have an omnibus on all due diligence legislation, putting something where companies can just follow step-by-step approach and they just understand what they need to do. So I think this would already create a little bit more clarity. But yes, there is this uncertainty right now, and we need to navigate through, as you call this panel, and we will accompany, of course, accession countries in this, as we do our member states. Member states have transposition workshops to which also countries in accession can attend. But I think besides this, we have different instruments. On one hand, we have this annual accession talks, where some questions can be asked. But this creates also an opportunity to get in touch on bilateral basis, on an informal basis with policy officers. Then we have also a setup where we have technical assistance and information exchange instrument for partner countries, where we have either we organize workshops for bigger public, like we did on ESG issues for financial sector, but also for others. We also can organize study visits or expert meetings. So there are different ways of doing this. And also there is country-specific technical assistance fund, which helps reforming countries in accession. So there are different ways how to support them. And of course, besides all these, coming back to CSDD specifically, there will be support measures. There will be guidelines, which will also apply, be applicable to them. There will be, we already have frequently asked questions. And there is, I think the message is really that we are open for contact. We are open for bilateral cooperation. And so we don't, there is uncertainty, but we will navigate to it together.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a few. I've picked on some of the things that you all have said, and I want to get more information on some of those. Heidi, you talked about the role of some of the industry associations or the business associations, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more on their role, also as opposed to the role of individual companies in those debates.
Yeah, I think it's very essential now to understand that perhaps also the situation is changing, that the European Commission may now, in this second Ursula von der Leyen term, be listening to industries. And there's nothing wrong about listening to industries, but obviously the most powerful voices are from the big countries and from the big industry associations. And I mean, I don't have to be a conspiration theoretician to say that it's very obvious to me that what preceded von der Leyen's announcement on the omnibus was deep discussions with the Italian, French and German big industry associations. So because, well, one proof is that they jumped immediately on her proposal, which to me shows that they probably were the architects of this proposal. And it's my very persistent observations from 20 years of EU lawmaking that these big industry associations really do not give the voice to those who are perhaps a little bit, let's say, in minority in terms of looking forward, wanting to change the business as usual concept, for instance, in the way that we are discussing today. And I have very sort of first-hand experience of how even the mouths of the more progressive companies can be shut in a situation where these associations are lobbying politicians. So I want to say this loud because it's all about a lack of decency and transparency in decision-making at the moment, and that we see concerning the procedures that have now been selected. Having said that, I also can see that once we can prove that it matters who wins the elections. Maybe it has been unclear to many by now, but looking a little bit deeper, we see that the majorities have really shifted. So if the CSDDD and the other two legislative proposals would end up in the hands of the co-legislators, including the European Parliament, I don't think we could expect something good for the continuation of this agenda, because we saw it, everybody saw what happened to the EU deforestation regulation. It was a near collapse, really disaster, but due to some very last-minute negotiations between the political groups, I think the worst was avoided. So the end is that indeed this one-year postponement of the enforcement was the result. But I think this, let's say, the narrative on competitiveness requiring scrapping the Green Deal has only become stronger So I don't think we would be having such an easy thing going to the co-legislators. I'm not saying anything on the member states. That's maybe someone else who could say a word on that. So that's my feeling, that it's really about the lack of transparency and lack of decency in a certain way. It's very disappointing because the EU has always declared that it follows the principles of better regulation, good governance. This is not what we are seeing at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to follow up on a slightly connected topic, actually, with you, Jeroen, because I think the Dutch experience with the responsible business conduct covenants and the way you've engaged, the way the government and all actors have engaged on these questions for many, many years, obviously plays a role in how you approach this transposition process, and you have mentioned it. And I think maybe also for some people in the audience and some people online, this is not something that perhaps everybody is aware of. And I wonder if you could push a little bit, explain a little bit more on that. And that connects to the question of how do we engage businesses beyond the industry associations, maybe. How do we engage businesses on these questions? Not necessarily with a compliance agenda or coming with, hey, there is a new law, now you have to comply, but by building relationships over time, whereby when legislation actually arrives, there is already these discussions and companies are not taken by surprise with it. I think this is an interesting experience that perhaps for accession countries or not, that actually is an interesting. I'm not going to say example because I think we could also debate whether that works. But I think it's nice to hear from you how that works and how do you think that impacts now this work you do on transposing this text?
Yes, certainly. The Netherlands has a long history. You mentioned already the governance, and that all started, of course, with the Rana Plaza collapse in 2013. That was followed up by some research being done by KPMG on sectors that are at risk of having these negative effects in their value chains, and that started in the Netherlands, at least the first policy and the approach that we used with the instrument of the governance. So it was a voluntary approach instrument where businesses work together with trade unions, with NGOs, and the Dutch government on improving human rights and environmental situations in their production chain. I think in the end we had like 10 or 11 of those covenants. Textiles being the first after Rana Plaza being launched. I think that was in 2015 or 16, the first one. I joined the ministry in 2018, specifically on the financial sector. So the banking agreement was already in place. I worked on the pension sector, and we also had the insurance sector. But other sectors were natural stone, which is due to continue, and also the textile collaboration will continue in due time. So we had a total of and now, well, the most recent one that started under the old policy, so to say, was on renewable energy. So companies are now working together in that sector, which is of course also very important at the moment. How are we going to set up an energy system that is sustainable? In 2019, we evaluated our policy and the approach of the voluntary instruments and had to conclude that it was not as effective as we hoped. The covenants were evaluated and the result was that only 1.6% of Dutch businesses were reached with this approach, which was a number that, of course, resonated in Parliament, like only 1.6% of the entire business field in the Netherlands. We also had a different goal that we could measure, the so-called 90% target, which requested that 90%, so 90% of the Dutch large companies would adhere to the OECD guidelines for their international activities. So we measured that a couple of times, and in 2019, it was found that only 35% of those large companies were adhering to the OECD guidelines. So that combined led to our conclusion, like voluntary approach is not enough. It's not going to move. You'll get a few front runners doing what you expect, but not the larger business community. So in 2020, we published our new policy, our responsible business conduct policy, which had a smart mix, which Alexandra already mentioned, of legislation and voluntary measures. And on the legislation part, of course, a law, preferably on EU level, was included. So that was in 2020. Heidi just mentioned before we started that around 2020, Reinders for the first time announced the CSDDD as a legislative part that was upcoming. Well, in the end, it took until February 2022 before it was published. In the meantime, well, we started in the Netherlands also with our own legislation. We even had the process in Parliament of an initiative law that was launched by a few political parties. So a lot was happening, but on the exact policy next to the legislation, as I mentioned, there is the voluntary part. So there are still like the continuation of the covenants, but then in a different setup where we still have sectoral agreements. We set up an RBC information center at the Dutch Enterprise Agency, RVO. So there's a group of colleagues there that answer questions from companies that have questions on due diligence, on the process, how to start with it. And this is available for all companies, not just companies that fall under the legislation, but also SMEs can go there for information. There are subsidies available. We used to have subsidy programs on anti-child labor and on responsible business conduct. And also now the new setup of sectoral agreements, there is funding available again. We also check for companies that want to go on trade missions with our minister or with our royals that often join. And they have to adhere to the OECD guidelines and show that they are working on that. And maybe as a last thing, you mentioned how do you engage companies to start with this and to. So I think what's really important, as I mentioned, there are a couple of front runners already in the Netherlands that are doing this. And these are not only the large companies. We know the Unilevers and the Philips that are far ahead in this. They also still have challenges, but they are far ahead. They have large teams working on this, on the reporting, on the due diligence. But we see a lot of examples of smaller companies doing the same in their businesses with the capacity that they have. SMEs, an example from the Natural Stone Covenant is Arte Group, which is making countertops from natural stones from India. And they analyze their whole value chain and selecting their producers in India that pay a decent wage to their workers. That's one example. And another nice example that maybe people are not so aware of in the Netherlands in the textile sector is Zeeman. And Zeeman is, of course, known for, they are in the, well, they're not on the high-end consumer spectrum. Their clothing is not expensive. But even in this business, they manage to find the textile manufacturers that do pay a decent wage and are taking care of their workers. So it is possible, and hopefully other businesses will be convinced shortly.
Thank you. I want to also follow up with Alexandra on something you said. You talked about these annual accession talks that are held with candidate countries, just I suppose to take stock of the process and see where they are. And you did mention then when your own country, if I can say, Slovakia, joined the EU, that these questions were not really, or maybe not at all, on the agenda. But I wonder, because it's very easy when you work on one area, which is also my case, to to forget that, of course, there are a multitude of other issues that need to be addressed in those talks. And so my question for you is, how big is, let's say in general, the responsible business conduct agenda in these talks? Is it really systematically discussed as a matter of policy, or like how do these talks work? How big is this agenda, I suppose, is my question, in those talks?
I mean, RBC is one part of industrial policy, you know, and probably not the biggest part in general, even inside of our directorate. And, you know, so clearly, you know, when you see what is happening with decarbonization and what you see, you know, in raw materials and other issues of industrial issues, you have different sectors where you have different challenges. So, but this is part clearly of a horizontal industrial policy. It's always discussed on the agenda. We always have this point together with social economy. Sometimes we need to also make it clear that sometimes there is a confusion between social economy and CSR. So we still keep explaining that this is not exactly the same thing, that we are, even though I have colleagues, we work in the same unit with social economy colleagues, we really need to distinguish what is the CSR linked questions and what is the context. And because I think also inside of the house, not everybody knows what is CSR, responsible business conduct. So, you know, I think it's, unless you work on these particular issues, it still needs some kind of awareness raising with other colleagues, and also in these accession talks. But yeah, it's, at least from the experience, I've been working on this in the last 2-3 years, participating in these accession talks, and it was there are always some questions. We always try to see how the countries in accession are advancing their agenda, but that they have a proper understanding, because sometimes we realize, like, for them CSR is maybe, oh, we do some kind of philanthropy and that's it, and we are fine. And, you know, sometimes even need to tell them, like, you know, you have to be in touch with OECD guidelines, UNGPs, you know, need to understand, you know, prepare some kind of a more strategy. How do you engage inside of the country? So there are questions on the, I would say, on the process inside of the country about how this is being dealt, but also to make sure that the understanding is the same as we have at the EU level.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, of course, please.
Yeah, I'd like to add a word on Ukraine. Having worked for, I think, close to 2 years now as a part of this high-level working group on environmental consequences of the war in Ukraine, we produced what we call Environmental Compact for Ukraine, and it has a couple of suggestions in one of its 3 chapters, namely the one on reconstruction, that governments and companies should follow the principles of responsible business conduct. And my experience is sort of, it's twofold, that I don't think this agenda is very well recognized anywhere, actually, among governments, because it's considered as a kind of a niche, whereas we should treat it as a kind of a horizontal issue dealing with almost anything.
And maybe also an enabler. What is not always seen, enabler to deliver on sustainable development goals, but enabler of certain resilience, better risk management. And this is most of the time not seen. Also, like, some governments really, and governments or companies see it as a burden, but they don't necessarily see what it can also bring them. It's not only about the burden. Otherwise, I think no one would do it, even the front runners. So I think this is something which still needs a lot of selling to the companies, selling to certain governments. And you also, you know, in the accession, you have different level of maturity. You have certain countries which are very much advanced, who have very good understanding what it means and how to do it properly. And they did some peer learning from other countries, maybe from some EU member states. But you have certain countries where, you know, I have to say that certain regions which are not in accession, which are completely out of EU, they are more advanced because they were part of the responsible supply chain programs run together with OECD and ILO. So there was some kind of work in the field. And I think this needs to happen even more now in this countries in accession and in certain regions, because it is very unknown agenda.
Yeah, I wanted to add that there is a very positive experience on Ukraine that indeed I've been a member of different kinds of committees and working groups which have produced reports for implementation, but I've never before seen a report like the one we produced, the Environmental Compact for Europe, which would directly go to some sort of implementation. And I'm sure that Olena and others will speak about it. Indeed, it didn't take long until we gave the report to President Zelensky a year ago, that there was already a kind of a plan on who is responsible, what's the timeline. And of course, it's still not the implementation, but it's a very good step towards implementation. And I very much hope that the Ministry of Economy will keep its interest in promoting the responsible business conduct agenda, because it will become very important in the reconstruction, and is already, because a huge flurry of foreign companies will rush to Ukraine for projects. And if there is not respect for the responsible business conduct principles as reflected in the CSDDD and in international standards, it can lead into a very bad development. So I very much trust that the first Vice Premier, Yulia Sviridenko, who hosted the conference a year ago in December 2023, where Olena was, I think, quite instrumental, together with UNDP, together with OECD, the EU. So it's been, I have to say that this cooperation and interaction between international organizations and the EU has been very important, and I hope it will be continuing in the context of the accession.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to say something?
Yes, add something also, well, what both Heidi and Alexandra mentioned. Because you mentioned the larger countries, France, Germany, Italy, that jumped on this omnibus, maybe being the architects, but at least very swiftly now came with position papers on how they see what needs to change. And those are strong voices from the business communities there. But as you mentioned, responsible business conduct also provides opportunities for businesses, and that's often forgotten. And recently we refer to it again in also answering parliamentary questions on this, because also in the Netherlands there are political parties that are critical on this, obviously. And we read back on the impact assessment that was done by the Commission on the CSDDD in 2022, and it actually mentions research that has been done that on the mid and longer term, the competitiveness of these companies and also attracting investors will outweigh the short-term costs that have to be made for this responsible business conduct approach. So, and that's also for the candidate countries, but also for Ukraine, something to keep in mind. Like it's, of course, there are maybe other priorities in the beginning, but don't just see it as a burden. It is an opportunity to attract investors, although maybe a lot of businesses, as you mentioned, will jump on the projects that will come up, but something to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you. I think we've been talking about businesses and industry associations and how to talk with them and how to maybe showcase some of the good examples and the front runners. I want to go in a slightly in a different direction. We've seen in the building the work around the Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that of course policymakers have worked tirelessly to make this happen. And we talked last night about late night, early morning discussions and nights, sleepless nights, and just an absolutely incredible amount of work that has been done on the side of the institutions of the EU. That I want to talk a little bit about civil society's role, because I know, because I'm sure many of you have met also some of these, and some organizations are represented today. that they too have worked tirelessly to make this happen, and it's been extremely difficult to keep the stamina and the momentum for so long. And of course, for them, what is happening at this moment with just re-putting this on the table is extremely upsetting, to say the least. So perhaps to be a little more positive about this, I wonder how do you see civil society organizations' role in pushing the responsible business conduct agenda beyond the directive, perhaps, whatever happens to it, and how do we valorize this role, and how do we make sure that that they can continue doing their work? This is, of course, in Brussels and in the EU, and also in the Netherlands, but also in candidate countries. I'm asking this, of course, with an agenda in mind, which is that we have now this Center of Excellence. Part of the mandate of the center, of course, is to produce academic research. This is still an academic institution, and I have a separate question on academics after that. But how do we support? How do we engage? What is needed? Is it education? Is it workshops? Is it all of this? What works basically in having a civil society organizations that really help, that push the agenda, that are useful, and that we can work together with? I don't know who wants to take this question. Maybe
I can start off maybe.
Sure. Yes.
Because we have a lot of experience in it in the Netherlands. Well, I mentioned already the covenant approach, where we work together with civil society organizations, and that's already a long-lasting tradition in the Netherlands. Maybe it comes from our polder model. It's not common in other countries. We speak to colleagues or also civil society organizations, explain, like our sister organization. I'm not going to name any specific country now, but the doors are closed at the corporate businesses, and you sit at the table with them. They are amazed. And also now in the transposition, but also the build up to the CSDDD, of course, you mentioned the long nights. I can relate to that. Also in every member state, probably a lot of people had late nights. Funny detail, recently we got a request. Well, in the Netherlands, of course, we have an open government, so people can request information like email exchanges from civil servants and on certain topics. So we had one recently, and so I was going through hundreds of emails. Well, and then you don't have to make everything black, but certain things that are confidential have to be made black, and your names are always blacked out. But a lot of emails to my colleagues in different departments were very late at night. Yes, I saw that back. But good, we reached the CSDDD, and that was the most important. And together with civil society, because we were getting constant letters pushing the boundaries. Can you include this topic in the CSDDD? Make it more prominent. It is in the recitals, but can it be more specific? And that's, well, it's very much valued because as I said, we have a long-lasting working relationship with them, and that still continues. Like in the transposition in the Netherlands now, we've had informal stakeholder meetings where we invite a number of representatives from these civil societies. We had our consultation, of course, that I mentioned, and a lot of organizations responded to that. And of course, they're pushing the boundaries up to a point that we cannot accommodate that, because the Dutch cabinet is about, as I say, a strict implementation of the guidelines, and we cannot add any, gold plating on it. So that's a restriction for us. But there are a lot of details in the regulation, or just the interpretation of the, there's the English text of the CSDDD. There is a Dutch translation, which already has some irregularities that if you look at the German translation or French translation. So there is room there for interpretation, and often those civil society organizations point us to, well, you've interpreted like this, but you can also look at it like this. And I would say, yeah, you have a point there. So it is important. that they are at the table and keep us sharp. So,
Yeah.
but I don't have to tell them that. I'm looking at some of them in the room.
Okay.
Jeroen, I have a request to you on the transposition, which comes from the civil society, is that the Geneva Conventions are mentioned in the preambles as a part of responsible business conduct in conflict areas. Could you not make that a little more explicit in the directive?
Yes, well, our approach to this is there is the directive and there's the recitals. So in the Netherlands, we are transpositioning the directive in a bill, and there's a memorandum of explanation in that bill. And our approach so far is like if certain conventions and well, ILO conventions, you name it, are in the recitals, then we can add them well as an explanatory note in that memorandum of explanation. But the text of the bill is the text of the bill, and we won't be able to push it through our cabinet or parliament if we add extra things to it. So that's unfortunately the restriction that we have.
But on the role of the civil society, I think now that we are moving towards implementation, nevertheless, I think it's important to emphasize one key concept in the directive, which is meaningful stakeholder engagement. And I've heard some really awkward speculation that this might be somehow limited to trade unions or whatever. I think it would be a grave mistake because I have seen it many times that the stakeholders, whether civil society or local communities, indigenous peoples, trade unions, they are often the best advisors of the companies, and even their worst critics can be their best advisors. So, and I've seen that many companies are afraid of contacting the stakeholder groups, which then leads to, let's say, a poor understanding of the operating environment and the risks that may lead into adverse impacts. So I think this is where companies need to be trained, and this has to be at the core of the organization. This cannot be outsourced. The company needs to be talking to the stakeholders to understand how to mitigate and remedy.
Yeah, I think actually I wanted to pass a little bit the same message that CSO should be seen as a partner. Because now they are seen like rather as an enemy, rather someone who might lead to some litigation cases, you know, that there will be a bit publicity, and they're not seen as a partner. But besides the stakeholder engagement, I mean, we had organized a meeting with 20 chief sustainability officers. And also in several position papers, what we hear, set up a multi-stakeholder platform. We need multi-stakeholder platform. So I think this is a clear message that there is a will to collaborate. Of course, on the CSDD, meaningful stakeholder engagement, we get a lot of questions because it's not clear how far you have to engage, with whom you should engage in every single supply chain, or, you know, only with certain ones. So, you know, so there is a lot of uncertainty around how to interpret this article. But I think it's important to have everybody around the table, and this was already the case. We had a CSR multi-stakeholder platform in, I think it was in 2020,
Yeah, you did, yeah.
if I'm not wrong. And it had a lot of positive feedback. So it's something we were trying to explore internally, whether we could set up maybe not a platform, as called platform, but maybe some kind of a working group or high-level group on CSR issues. But of course, this is still at a very early stage, and we will need to see first what happens with the omnibus. So I think that's where we are right now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And then I have a final question for all of you, and then maybe we can open the floor to the audience. I'll find my words. So I want to ask, and I know we did discuss this a little bit already, but what role do you see for academic institutions in this in pushing this responsible business agenda?
I have Mike.
Okay.
I think we see a very big role of academics because we need data. We need to show that there is a business case. We need education. On one hand, we need also, you know, certain skills for implementation. So I think the one hand, we need academia to follow certain new pathways and to prepare the future generations to implement all the sustainability agenda. But on the other hand, we also need the research and we need the data. What is the impact? How much does it cost? What it brings? How to measure it? I think also explaining what does it mean in practice, the risk-based approach, how you properly implement this without necessarily having the liability issues on your back. So I think there are a lot of topics which could go into much deeper understanding and awareness raising broadly. So I think we launched some of the studies where we have also, some funding, but also our fundings are limited and also our capacities are limited. So we are happy when we get some very well evidenced data and studies from academia as well. So,
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I can only echo that. Didn't even mention that we did a lot in the transposition. We also had an expert panel with academics, specific their background on law, and yeah, as you mentioned, we need the research. I already mentioned the impact assessment from the Commission. That kind of research is instrumental to at least convince people why this is important. And now that implementation is really going to start, fingers crossed. Now, as we said, the core of the due diligence will of course remain in place, but let's see what will change in scope or other details. So yeah, and then well, the Commission has an evaluation plan for 2030, but earlier maybe already academics will start with what are the actual effects? Are companies now actually walking the talk before you could write it down in your report and present it nicely? But do you really have an effect in your value chain? And for that, yeah, we need the research and the data. And so I'm looking at Martijn and our colleagues to start with that. Well, he's already very busy on that.
Thank you.
I think some of my most rewarding experiences as a lawmaker over the years have been interactions with academics. It works both ways. As a lawmaker, you get a better understanding of on what ground certain political measures, decisions, laws lie. And then you can inspire academics with just ideas about what to research more. And I mean, we could discuss this just at this very moment. And I already mentioned in my first intervention that I think this, let's say, prevailing understanding of competitiveness vis-a-vis responsible business conduct, vis-a-vis the Green Deal, whatever, would need a more critical look because it's taken as granted and it is now leading the decision makers into, I would say, poorly understood decisions.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think we can start with questions from the audience. We have people online, but also we have people in the room.
We have enough with one mic, Olena, so use this one.
Yeah. Thank you. Whoop. There were people with hands. No, let's start with the audience. There was there's people in the room with questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'm from the civil society and from academics, so I have a question from that side. It seems that, like what you were saying about the lack of transparency within the European Union, that seems a very big problem to me. So my question is actually very simple. What can be done, mainly on an institutional level, but also from academics and civil society, to counter the influence or the increasing influence of big business on decision-making in the European Union? Is my question.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take a few questions and then we can see who wants to take it. Please introduce yourself.
Hi.
Know you, but
I'll do that. Good morning. My name is Kees Gootjes and I'm the director and only employee of a Dutch faith-based investor association. And that's why my question is also, I was very happy to hear, I believe it was Heidi referring to Draghi's report being called the Bible. So, you know, as a faith-based organization, I right away feel a bit of a connection there. And that's actually kind of the basis of my question as well. Many of the arguments that have been put forward are very sort of, and this is not meant as a criticism, but very sort of practical, technocratic almost. And I feel like this discussion and also the worldview that Trump and other governments and things are putting forward is very much transactional. And I believe there's also more of an ethical, moral argument to why Europe needs to, you know, be this, hopefully, this shining light when it comes to human rights. And so I'd want to ask the panel to kind of reflect on, in addition to, you know, the very practical, why it's good for business or why it's good for the environment or whatever, to kind of get into more of the moral argument. Why should we still care about human rights in this time?
Thank you. Esra?
Hey, thank you. I'm Esra Hautala. I'm a member of the law group here in Wageningen University. I have actually a question to Alexandra, if I may. It's like next to my professional curiosity also because I have Turkish roots. So talking about accession candidate countries, I'm wondering what differences you see in the approach that they have. Like of the all 9 candidate countries, I think not all, firstly, pays same level of attention to human rights or sustainability, knowing from the Turkish perspective at least. And secondly, because of the status of the relationships with the EU, which with Turkey is stagnant to call the very least. So how does that impact your work while talking about corporate sustainability with accession countries? Do you see like the difference in their approach, and how does that impact the approach of the European Commission while talking about that? Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe we'll just take one more question from the audience, and then we can have a round of see who wants to take.
Good morning. I'm Silvia Rolandi, and I'm a member of the law group as well. And I thank you very much for this wonderful, insightful speech today. I'm very proud of Nadia and the entire group. And I do have a question about the assessment of the effects of war in the environment in Ukraine. And if one of the aspects that has been considered is the effect of the war on the soil. So from an environmental perspective, and if the value of that land then will change.
Thank you. Soil quality, yeah. Okay, so we've got 4 questions, very different. I don't know if you... Alexandra, do you want to start maybe on the question on institutions and what we can do for more transparency?
I think on the most transparency, I think we have open door for everybody. We are not listening just to businesses, even though it looked like this, but the last consultation actually was what they called reality checks. So the consultation was really focusing on the businesses and understanding where they have challenges. So I think the usual setup of better regulation and transparency is still there. We still equally meet, even I'm coming from really directorate, which is business focused, and we still have meetings with CSOs when they come to us, when they ask for a meeting, we receive the position papers. So we don't take only business opinion in mind. And we try to really understand where is the right balance between all these, how to make this work, how to make it implementable, and how to make it efficient. So I think in this area, at least from our level, I think we still keep the better regulation at the core of our work. And I think, and this is also, I mean, now all the commissioners are responsible for simplification, but also better regulation, so there will be some more implementation dialogues, which will also involve the voices of the CSO. So I think there's really, with this new mandate, my impression is that we really want to listen more what's happening outside and be maybe less in the Brussels bubble between the policymakers and different institutions. So I think that's my personal perception on this. I don't know if you want me to tackle other questions or
maybe the question on Turkey and whether how different candidate countries approach this agenda differently.
I mean, you will be probably aware that there are some now, maybe some more speed up accession processes with certain countries. This is clearly, we spoke about critical raw materials, strategic raw materials. So I think there is really this need to accelerate certain countries because there is this potential also to include certain supply chains in the EU single market. But I think from the perspective of CSR, our approach is still the same. As I mentioned, there is different maturity of the countries. Not all the countries have the same rule of law. Not all the countries have same approach to human rights. We still try to push in this as based on the UNGPs, as based on the OECD guidelines, to go in this direction and explain that also governments have their role, not only businesses. So I think we can continue passing the message. Of course, we can, it might take more time. Not everybody is at the same starting line. So this is ongoing process. There are differences in the talks because we cannot maybe speak about national action plans when the country doesn't even understand what does it mean, the UNGPs, and what does it mean, what is the due diligence process. So I think you have to adapt the rhythm, but the objective is always the same.
Thank you. Jeroen, did you want to take?
Maybe add a little bit to the first question. What can be done on transparency and to counter the big businesses, as you say. I think, listen to both of them. As Alexandra said, the door is open to everyone. And we also apply that in the Dutch transposition of the CSDDD. So our informal stakeholder meetings, we invite businesses. VNO, the Dutch business representation is there. But also MVO Platform and other civil society branch organizations are invited. And I think the biggest maybe signal to them or to the big businesses is because they are complaining a lot that it's complicated, that it's not doable. But actually the first reports under the CSRD are already published now. Recently I saw 2 Danish companies that have published their annual report completely aligned with the CSRD requirements. So it shows it is possible to all the other companies, definitely the bigger companies that should make the capacity available. So hopefully that's also inspiring for other businesses that it can be done.
Thank you.
Maybe on cases, questions on, or Heidi, I don't know if you want to add. Okay. Case, the transactional that has been, or at least the examples that we gave here. But what about the ethics? Can completely relate to that. Maybe more even from a personal level than from a work profession, seeing what's happening now in the world with Trump's second term, which is really, as he's shown in his first weeks, is about him. For him, it's about the deal and making the transaction. I think it underlines why in Europe, and that was also, I think, the first response on the Munich Security Convention. We shouldn't be told by others, especially not the US maybe, what our values are on human rights and what we find important. So we have to push ahead, whether it's the CSDDD or other sustainability framework related legislation. We are a big bloc as the EU, looking at our GDP. It's comparable to the US. It's a lot bigger than Russia's GDP, and that should be important in the end, also for Trump. So I think we stay firm and make a stand on what are our ethics and what we expect from businesses, and hopefully we can convince others.
Thank you. Heidi?
Yeah, on the transactional versus the moral agenda, I think we are very much at a junction now, because it seems that the whole sort of rule of law base in the EU is shaking, and this is worrying because at the level of treaties, the EU member states are very committed to upholding and defending the rule of law. And now we see that it's not just Hungary, it's spreading. And I think with the transatlantic winds now, or storms, we will see more of that, which is I think it's a danger, because then it means that the EU really risks losing its moral compass. And that also has to do with, let's say, in the area of migration, we see now these very, I would say, transactional agreements between the EU and Tunisia. There was the one with Turkey, which is like buying freedom of following international treaties and conventions on right of asylum and things like that. So it is a crucial moment. And I think that the faith-based organizations can play a big role in sort of keeping this flame alive. They should not be asked to do it alone, but they can be a good voice in that. Then on the impact of big business, I think one of the sort of upheavals in the EU over 30 years has been that now we have a kind of a progressive law on access to information, which was already referred to by Jeroen and others. And we have to sort of keep testing that, because there is always this tendency to do things behind closed doors. But I myself, I've had a couple of victories in the Court of Justice, and even this blackening some phrases has a name. It's called Hautala principle, because it was the principle of partial access to documents. I don't have to explain to you, you're legal experts, but it's that's my monument. So then on the effects of the war in Ukraine on the value of land, if I understood the question properly, I think we have to understand that a very large part of the territory is mined by Russians, and that certainly will be a very big loss of the value of land. And I've been observing how the Ministry of Economy is in charge of the demining, and international partners are helping, but that's certainly one aspect. Then on the minerals, actually I shouldn't say much, but I'm just aware that in my country, which is also rich in critical minerals, the land, the value of the land it does not reflect the value of the minerals. Anybody can come and explore. Anybody can establish a mine if they fulfill the legal requirements, whether it's Anglo-American or whatever, Rio Tinto. And they can take away the minerals with very little, let's say, benefit to the local population or the country. So that could be discussed maybe in other sessions.
Thank you. Thank you. We have one question online that Chiara is going to relay. Thank you.
Yes. So the first one is by Sarah van den Broeke and is mainly for Jeroen, because it's about the sectorial covenants. Sarah says, it seems that the only reason they did not work, these covenants, is because businesses did not join the initiative. It is unfortunate, she says, because the sectorial approach is most likely to be effective in promoting human rights in supply chains. So she asks, is there another sectorial way forward envisioned in the future due diligence approach in the Netherlands that would be mandatory? And will this Social and Economic Council hold any role in the CSDDD transition?
Good question. Thank you, Sarah. No, yeah, for the covenants not being as effective as we hoped. Of course, there are highlights, the annual reports and also the final statements and reports of the covenants that have been closed or will continue do show progress, do show more awareness in the sector. Referring to the own covenant that I also guided is the pension sector, knowing that investments can make a change also in investments that are done for businesses. can work as a lever. It's at least for me, reconfirming that over 90% of the Dutch pension sector, and the Dutch pension sector is one of the largest in the world, is now applying the OECD principles. It's a step forward. They are not there yet. They haven't completed all the 6 steps, but it's now in their responsible business investment policies, and that's a start. Other sectors, well, there were even sectors that came out of the risk assessment of KPMG that never wanted to start an agreement at all. My colleagues that started before me have knocked on many doors and had many conversations, and probably to no surprise, the oil and gas sector was not inclined to start an agreement with civil society and trade unions and the government on improving. They said, we can do that ourselves. Well, you can see the lawsuits that are happening now with Shell and other companies. They're not there yet. For the future, as I mentioned, we are continuing with this approach. It's now called sectoral cooperation. The setup is slightly different from the role of the government, as we are also making these legislations and are involved in also the supervising authority on these legislations. We concluded that we cannot have the same role at the table as an equal partner, but we are still available for information requests. We will still link these initiatives to our embassies if they are operating in certain countries and need information. And we provide the funding, of course, when companies do want to work together with civil society organizations, with trade unions. They can set up a new agreement and request funding. And with regard to the role of the Socioeconomic Council, I'm not sure how it is set up, if they are always going to be the secretariat or if that's an option. If the group of businesses that want to collaborate set up their own secretariat, I believe that's also an option, but I'm not completely into the details of this new approach. So apologies for that, but I can come back to Sarah. I believe I'm linked to her, so I know her name.
Thank you. And then there's
Perfect. The last question by Alexia Hervig. She asks, my question pertains to multi-stakeholder initiatives. These are often organized at member state level, for instance, on chocolate, coffee, textiles, yet companies have pan-European buying strategies. Does this not imply that MSI should better or also be organized and perhaps funded at the European Union level?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I think Alexandra, sorry, you mentioned that as an option, no?
Yeah, well, we as I said, like we want to work in a multi-stakeholder setup. Going there into initiative, I don't know, because you can have initiatives on a little bit like you have on different sectors, different supply chains. I think we will really need to see how to frame this. But I think what we really want to get is different stakeholders around the same table and understand what are the challenges in general. Also, we don't have funds to run these kind of things at EU level, so I think this is a big issue. We don't have capacities to do multi-stakeholder initiatives or in some kind of recognition of them. There were some tentatives to recognize at least maybe more local ones or national ones at OECD and within our conflict minerals regulation, but it's extremely complicated. So I think at the A level, honestly, I don't see practically how it could happen besides having some kind of a multi-stakeholder platform to discuss things, but not really having an initiative that goes to certain certification or that leads to certain, code of conduct. Maybe that could be a way, but I think it needs a sectorial approach. You need a very specific supply chain approach. I think it's very difficult to have one on every single issue. So I think we would need to prioritize where our resources are the most needed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, but I also very much believe that as the importance of the business and multi-stakeholder initiatives have been written into the directive Article 29.4, this also means that companies can do it themselves with other stakeholders. You don't necessarily need the EU. There have been good one primary example for me of where EU got involved was this Sustainable Cocoa Initiative, which is at the EU level. It's between the EU and Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and a little bit Cameroon, I think. It involved the cooperation very unusually between 3 different DGs from the Commission: DG Trade, DG Environment, DG International Partnership. I don't think it was easy to get 3 commissioners to sit for 1 hour in the same room, I was told. So, and this really has been a multi-stakeholder initiative from African countries to the EU, civil society, producers. But then there comes a point where, let's say, progress is not anymore guaranteed. And one of the stumbling blocks, the main stumbling block here has been the fair pay. You know, the premiums, the living wage, the living income. And there I would say that the courage and interest of the companies reach their limits very easily. So there need to be maybe other ways to continue. But and this has been by side of what they call Cocoa Coalition, which has been one of the most ardent voices in favor of the mandatory legislation in the EU for many, many years. And they are still, when the others shut up and don't speak because they don't know what's going on, they do. That's great. Nestle, Unilever, others. And then you have Responsible Business Alliance for Electronics, which have been struggling with identifying forced labor in the value chains. But it's also very important to see that the further down you go in the value chain, the more important this kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives are. Because why? Because, for instance, the same brands can produce in the same factories. So a number of brands can produce in the same factory in Bangladesh or Malaysia. And then they can help each other to identify the risks. And some say that there is a bit of a problem vis-a-vis competition law. If there is any, that has to be solved, because this kind of cooperation is really very valuable.
Maybe final
maybe
word.
what I forgot to mention that well, okay, there is many times you see many times there is sectorial approach or very, very specific approach. What we see currently as one possible thing for such a setup would be how you access the data, how you share the data, because that's overarching in all supply chain, all value chains, how you share the audits, what you can share, and we are coming to the competition issue as well. So this is something we are looking very closely at. We are thinking maybe, how to address it. One thing is how to develop certain technologies, but also other issues, how to maybe have a voluntary code of conduct between the companies on data sharing, data access, what data and how. So it's, again, one work stream of the smart mix. It's maybe not the classical multi-stakeholder initiative as we know it by now, but this is something which we really are analyzing very closely.
Thank you. I think this is...
I see Olena very nervous. She wants to cut it off.
I think...
But we're just going to lose coffee time, right? If I make a final statement.
I just want to... I just want to thank all 3 of you for this wonderful panel this morning. I'm very grateful and very happy to have you here. Thank you, and it's time to break for coffee, and we'll see you back here at 11:30. Thank you.